Good evening, and thank you for joining us in celebration of the publication of the first volume of Lyre, Studies in Poetry and Lyric. The publication of a new journal is always an exciting and happy event. The process of establishing a journal is rife with thoughts, plans, toil, and effort. This event is thrilling because it marks the start of setting out on a new path with the expectation and wish that it will continue into the future, gaining more depth and developing. Lyre combines research studies in poetics that focus on Hebrew poetry from various periods, poetry written in several Jewish languages, and high-quality poetry being written in Israel, Lyre wishes to spread its special light in Israel and abroad. Lyre is a cooperative effort made by 3 editors, colleagues, and friends. Professor Chanita Goodblatt from Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, Professor Neta Stahl from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, and myself, Professor Tamar Wolf-Monzon from Bar-Ilan University. We 3 are dedicating our professional lives to the research of poetry, and especially of Hebrew poetry. We consider poetry to be much more than merely an object of research, but rather as a means of expression, perhaps even a way of life, or a way to experience life. The harsh and painful reality that has been thrust upon us these past months, since the horrific events of October 7th, has awakened question and doubts regarding our scientific endeavors. Are they meaningful? Are they essential against the background of such dreadful events? After being so shocked and shaken, our normal and creative lives had been disrupted. However, the sense of uncertainty and instability exposed us to an additional dimension that exists in the object of our research, the therapeutic power of poetry. These past months have honed the feeling that our study of poetry is not a form of escape or detachment, but the creation of an enabling space, giving pause, allowing a deeper examination of the soul, touching the pain, and exposing all its complexities. The pain is approached indirectly, in ways that regulate and refine it. Good poetry avoids overly explicit statements or excessive emotions. Good poetry strives for multiple meanings and intends to awaken the reader's curiosity and interest. Good poetry tries to gain the reader's full attention and to resonate with them. Good poetry is never false. Sometimes it's shocking and disturbing. Sometimes it's comforting and merciful. Nevertheless, good poetry is always an invitation to discover oneself and one's entire gamut of sensations and emotions, and maybe that's the source of its therapeutic power. We decided to devote the first volume of Lyre to the murdered civilians and fallen soldiers in the war that began on October 7th, with prayers for the safe return of our hostages, the physical and mental healing of our wounded, and for the success of our IDF forces in this war. Being aware of the therapeutic power of poetry and its ability to be precise in its expressions of pain, in the opening section, we included 3 poems that echo the harsh reality and process it, each one in its unique way. Our hope is that the readers will find their own sensations resonating within them. In this first section, we also included 2 wonderful collages created by Sivana Shefi in the context of these dreadful days. We wish to thank her for letting us incorporate them. Our journal is being published by the Bar-Ilan University Press, so I wish to open this evening by inviting the Rector, Professor Amnon Albeck, to say a few words of greeting.
Shalom, Tami. Good evening, everyone. The Department of the Literature of the Jewish People is home for research and learning of Hebrew, Israeli, and Jewish literature. And as such, it spans a very wide space of time, geography, culture, and probably a few other dimensions which I didn't mention, and which I'm even not aware of. As you mentioned, Tami, these are difficult times for the state of Israel, and I think that for all mankind. And since Shmini Atzeret, since October 7th, we're in the midst of a crisis, a national crisis. And on the other hand, people are talking about the crisis of humanities in general in recent years. And I think that in light of these 2 crises, launching a new journal is in the field of poetry and lyric is a very good reason for celebration. That's not something that we launch every single day. And establishing the journal Lyre, specifically here at Bar-Ilan, by this specific department, makes me really proud and thankful. This is not something that we experience every day. I wish that Lyre, the journal that you're establishing now, will become home, or I would even say a shrine, for all those who believe in the human spirit and values despite these difficult times. I think it should be a living proof that the humanities are still here to flourish and contribute to mankind. And at times when we all highly appreciate engineering and STEM fields, we should not forget the human spirit. And I think that this is I would say even almost I would say a burden, but a very serious task that you, Tami, and Bar-Ilan University take upon itself. We're in the midst of reading the Parshiot of Bniyat HaMishkan, building of the temple, and the central role that the altar and the priests play in this in the Jewish central worship. And I think that our sages, Chazal, put a very strong emphasis both for the altar and for the priests to be a center for, or taking a role of making peace between God and the Jewish people, and between God and the rest of at the level of individuals, husband and wife, different individuals. And I think that this very tough, rough times of war, hatred, agony, I think that such a journal, or I hope that this journal will also serve as a place of peace, a place of friendship, a place for the human spirit to take its important position for the benefit of us and all mankind. So again, thank you very much for all those. And I'm referring to you, Tami, but I'm sure that there are many people behind this project I wish the journal to flourish, to really be a center for human beings to delve into. And I also wish us all a very interesting evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Albeck, for your warm welcome. This is also an opportunity to thank Professor Shulamit Michaeli, the Vice President for Research, for her help and support. We appreciate the support of the Faculty of Jewish Studies. We would like to thank Maya Yonati, the Administrative Head of the Faculty of Jewish Studies, and the former Dean, Professor Yaron Ariel, for their support. I am honored to invite the current Dean of the Faculty of Jewish Studies, Professor Shmuel Refael, to offer greetings on behalf of the faculty.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to bring the greetings of the Faculty of Jewish Studies to the participants in this special event dedicated to the launch of the Lyre digital journal. In the preface to the journal, the three editors wrote, "Now is the time for poetry." I was thinking about that argument and found it to be correct, even if it refuses the well-known saying that when the cannons roar, the muses are silent. It turns out, however, that the muses are not silent at all, and the severe reality in which we have been living since October 7th, we are learning that the difficult events have given birth to a great many poems. Indeed, many people have found poetry as a type of escapism and consolation, exactly the comfort the editors of this journal discuss. There is something promising about poetry. Everything we cannot express on usual daily language, we may try to say in a poetic language. Poetry allows itself freedom, liberty. It is not bound by what is nice, pleasant, by what we want to hear. Poets tend to be poetic even during wartime. Just recently, a poet from New York wrote to me and asked me to translate a short poem of his about the reality of war. I was very touched by this request. Here, few lines from the poem. The title is With. Who am I to speak of peace, so long at war with myself? How can I call for others to reach across their divides when I'm plagued by small aids? I've no wisdom to offer, only hope and compassion for all who suffer the grief of violence done against them by land, for God, for the wounds. And here is the short translation into Hebrew. מי אני שאדבר על שלום כשמלחמת האינסוף היא לחם חוקי? וכיצד זה עטיף לאחרים לחצות את גבולות עצמם בעודי נגוע בשנאות קטנות? אין בי חוכמה להציע, רק משאלת לב וחמלה לכל מי שבשרו צרוב, באלימות קשה, בשם האדמה, בשם האל, בשם עוד מכה אנושה. מבעד למלמולי הלשון מהדהד כל ניגון ותפילה, מפיג את חרדת הלב, ניגון בשולי המילים המפלגות, המפצלות כל כך. במפגש נערות של שירה שזורמים לים, מקוואות שיבשו נמלאים אהבה. Mark Zagans, New York, December 2023. I found the measure of consolation in these short lines. In these difficult times, it is comforting to know that poetry lovers are willing to do everything to keep it alive and continue its research. I would like to thank the editors of Lyre, Professor Tamar Wolf-Monzon from Bar-Ilan University, Professor Chanita Goodblatt from Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, and Professor Neta Stahl from Hopkins University. I am also grateful to the members of the Department of Literature of the Jewish People and the staff of the Bar-Ilan University Press. And I wish this new journal's success may be filled with poetry both in times of war and in times of peace. Thank you very much.
Lyre is the auspices of the Department of Literature of the Jewish People, and it expresses the great spirit of the department, my department, that researches the essence of the Hebrew literature treasures written in the languages of the Jews. I would like to thank the former head of the department, Professor Refael Vivanti, who already believed in Lyre from the initial stage. Special thanks also go to Professor Tohar, the current head of my department, and to the Yitzhak Akaviau Fund, established in memory of the poet. I now call on Professor Tohar to greet us on behalf of the department.
Thank you, Tammy. Good evening, I'm delighted to be here. Honorable Rector of Bar-Ilan University, Honorable Dean of the Faculty of Jewish Studies, Honorable Head of the Bar-Ilan Publishing House, dear editors, colleagues, students, and guests. In behalf of the Department of the Literature of the Jewish People and as the head of the department, I would like to welcome you to our humble celebration tonight, marking the publication of Lyre Studies in Poetry and Lyric. I'm very proud and happy to congratulate Professor Tammy Wolf-Monzon, Professor Chanita Goodblatt, and Professor Neta Stahl on their new and exciting venture, a digital and international peer-reviewed academic journal. As we all know, this new journal will be dedicated to poetry and to the study of poetry in the Hebrew, Israeli, and Jewish worlds. This project joins the two long-standing referee journals published by the Department of the Literature of the Jewish People, Criticism and Interpretation for the Study of Literature and Culture, and Ladinar for the study of Ladino culture. Lyre thus leads the department into a new era and a new academic adventure. The essence of this era is the creation of an immediate and direct dialogue with the international community concerning Hebrew, Israeli, and Jewish poetry. I also see this step as an important move towards creating unmediated access to the contemporary scene of Israeli poetry for English readers all over the world. I believe that the connection between theory and practice and between writing poetry and writing about poetry is a blessed and fulfilling step. The articles in the first issue by Yosheva Samet Sheinberg, Tova Cohen, Harriet Morav, Michael Gluzman, Tamar Yacobi, Karen Alkalai Gott, and Hannah Kronfeld, as well as the poetry of all editors and the visual art of Sivan Arshefi, and the essay by Tamar Wolf-Monzon create a wonderful volume for all poetry lovers. Our joy tonight is mixed with great sadness over the disaster of October 7th and over the terrible war that has been going on ever since. I pray for the immediate return of the kidnapped and captives and for all our soldiers and citizens to return safely to their homes. We are an ancient people who have known much suffering and sorrow throughout history. May we live in peace and serenity in our country and continue to engage in matters of culture and humanities, which have been the basis of Jewish existence for generations. Dear Tammy, Chanita, and Neta, Mazal Tov. I wish you I wish that you will see a blessing in your wonderful project and that you will be able to keep the journal vital and fruitful for many more years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Verd. Lyre is being published by the academic press of Bar-Ilan University, and I must say that we could not have found a more professional, devoted, and creative publisher. We offer our deepest thanks to the wonderful Deputy Director of this academic press, Miss Rachel Joseph, for her vision, creativity, and precision. Now I call on the Director of the Bar-Ilan University Press, Dr. Alex Stahl, for his greetings on the publication of Lyre.
Good evening, everyone, and especially the editors, and more specifically, Tami. It's a joy working with you on this project and others as well. May we work together for success and enjoyment. The Lyre Manifesto, proudly appearing on its site's masthead, reads, quote, Lyre is unique in its dedication to highlighting the transculture and translingual dimensions of both the poetry of Hebrew and Jewish languages and the poetry of Israel. It creates a space for conversation between scholars and poets, which further crosses cultures and languages. As such, this journal brings both the poetry of Hebrew and Jewish languages and the poetry of Israel to the knowledge of an international forum, thereby promoting a discussion of these texts within a comparative transnational context, unquote. The underlying axiom here is that Hebrew poetry actually interests people outside the confinement of our Semitic language. It was not that long ago that Yalag, Yehuda Leib Gordon, foresaw and lamented in what was probably his most famous poem, its demise. Here are its last few lines, translated, of course. I, mere mortal, for the handful remaining lovers of Hebrew, who have not yet mocked her and scorned. Yes, to you I sacrifice my soul and my tears. I weep on your shoulders and share my pain. I grasp you and embrace you again and again. Oh, who can foresee the future? Who can say, am I not the last of Zion's poets, and you, the last readers? Well, times have changed. Hebrew and Hebrew literature and poetry are definitely not dead. On the contrary, they are alive and kicking, and definitely interesting. This wonderful virtual project we are celebrating here is proof. So much so that we are now facing a different menace, that of losing identity, of turning what has taste into a bland world literature written in Hebrew letters for everybody and nobody. Here, Lyre brings opportunity as well as danger. It opens a highway between cultures, enriching each intersection on it. Let it not obliterate those unique, precious towns flourishing along its way. Thank you and good luck.
Thank you, Dr. Tal. The idea of founding this journal was first conceived in the active mind of Professor Chanita Goodblatt from the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. I will now pass the microphone to my friend Chanita so she can tell us more about the rationale behind this journal and its special characteristics.
Okay, just a minute. Chanita, you need to unmute. I did. Okay. Can you hear me all now? Okay. I remember very well how Tamar and I sat together in Hotel Yerushalayim after a fascinating day at a conference on the poet Uri Tzvi Greenberg, which Tamar had organized. Over dinner and coffee in the lobby, we spun our dreams for a journal about poetry. For the two of us, and later on with Neta, believed strongly and still believe that the time had come for assembling research about the great wealth of poetry written in Israel, as well as in Hebrew and in Jewish languages throughout the world. All three of us are involved in Israeli and international studies of Hebrew, Jewish, and Israeli poetry, and have been aware that outside of a small circle of scholars and enthusiasts, the world has not been offered sufficient access. We dreamed our dreams, harnessed our combined efforts, and have been blessed with seeing these dreams realized. And here I want to thank Neta and Tommy for wonderful friendship and collegiality, and for Bar-Ilan University Press for the support that they gave us in this project. Tevarchu kulchem. Lyre is unique in its dedication to highlighting the transcultural and translingual dimensions of both the poetry of Hebrew and Jewish languages and the poetry of Israel. Furthermore, Lyre is also unique in containing two sections, one which presents scholarly articles and poetry, as well as essays of reflective and cultural value, and one which introduces the reader to poetry written in Israel, in a variety of languages, English, Russian, Hebrew, Arabic, Ladino, which reflect the rich mosaic of cultures that flourishes here. Each issue is thus dedicated to a contemporary poet working in Israel and includes original poems accompanied by a comprehensive essay about the author's poetries. This combination creates a space for conversation between scholars and poets, which further crosses cultures and languages. While there are literary journals in which poetry is published and journals in which scholarly articles on poetry are published, Lyre positions poetry at the center of an innovative approach. This approach delineates a shared space for scholarship and poetic creativity, focusing on a major genre that spans historical periods, languages, and cultures of Jewish and Israeli experiences. In the present volume, the variegated nature of Jewish and Israeli poetry is certainly at the fore. The first three articles in the section, Studies in Poetry, focus on poetry written in Europe in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. Yoshefa Samet Sheinberg examines the motif of the harp in the Hebrew poetry of the Jewish Enlightenment, or Haskalah, through three channels: the harp as a vignette or a graphic attribute on the title pages of books, the inclusion of the word harp or nevel in book titles, and the harp as a literary figure. The following two articles focus respectively on individual poets. Tova Cohen, who we'll be hearing from in a minute, turns our attention to the Italian-Jewish Rachel Morpurgo from the 19th century, the first modern Hebrew woman poet. Cohen discusses poems that Morpurgo addressed to specific individuals, allowing her to overcome her isolation as a learned and creative woman within a conservative Jewish society. Harriet Murav examines the Jewish term hefker, meaning unclaimed, abandoned, or neglected property, in early 20th century Yiddish and Hebrew poems by David Hofstein. She does so specifically in relation to its exploration of sensory listening, discussing ethical dimensions, and the poet's experience of the Kiev programs, which ultimately shatters the possibility of his listening. The following four articles in this section are devoted to poetry written in Israel in several languages. Michael Glusman writes in the poem Afra Da'ara, Dust of the Earth, Uri Nisan Gnessin Be'eretz Yisrael, Uri Nisan Gnessin in the Land of Israel, written by the Israeli-American poet Harold Schimmel. Glusman reads this poem as a self-reflection on Schimmel's own immigration to Israel and on his choice of Hebrew over his mother tongue. Tamar Yacobi discusses ekpharsis, the literary description of visual work of art, as an exemplar of meta-representation in Dan Pagas's poetry. She shows that various poems mix the dramatization of representational problems with open commentary. They thereby do so from unusual, estranging viewpoints that compound and thematize meta-representational issues. Karen Alkali-Good explores the development of what she terms Anglo-Saxon poets in Israel and examines their relationship to the local literary and cultural identity. By comparing poems from the 1970s, when the Israeli Association of Writers in English was founded, with poems written today, the distinction of subject matter regarding political and cultural controversies becomes clear. Concluding this section, Hannah Kronfeld, who we would also be hearing from shortly, focuses on the poetry of Adi Kesar, particularly on her concerns with poetics and with the intersections of lyric poetry and society. Kronfeld also presents a complex reading of Kesar's poem, Memshelet Laila, The Dominion of Night, as a pastiche of east-west citations and a meta-poetic rewriting of Genesis 1:16. Following these articles and essays, the section entitled Poetry of Israel introduces us to new poetry by Sivan Har-Shefi with a discussion and reading by Tami and Sivan. I'd like to conclude with a few words. Tami, Neta, and I have dedicated this volume of Lyre to the memory of those who were murdered and those who were killed in battle in the October 7th war. We continue to pray for the return of all the captives and for the safety of our soldiers. Each of us, Tami, I, and Neta, have included a poem at the beginning of this volume, and I would like now to present my own. My friend and colleague, Ilana Rosen, will read the original Hebrew poem, and then I will read the English translation. So I have two requests. Could we unmute Ilana? Is that working? Ilana, can you unmute Yofi? And if I could have permission to upload a share screen. Just a minute. Share screen, great. Just a moment, I'll put the poem up. Okay. Just a moment. Okay, I have a problem here. Okay, slideshow. Okay. Okay, and I have a chat question here. Okay. Ilana, would you like to read it?
Yeah. Good evening. 7 באוקטובר 2023, חניתה גודבלט. א', הפצצה על הירושימה נחת עליי אבל אינסופי, מחק את המציאות ומילא את ליבי אפר. נשורת עצבות מכסה את כל עולמי, מרעילה את מחשבותיי, פולטת קרינה שהופכת את חלומותיי להזיות אפלות. ב', במיטה, בקומה השלישית של הבית, אני נתלית בין הזיות וזמנים. רעש המטוסים שעוברים בשמיים השחורים מעליי, וקולות ההתקפות על עזה, מחזירים אותי להודעות ההיסטריות ברדיו על מסכות גז, ולרעש המצמרר של התנגשות מכוניות בצומת ליד בית נעוריי. ג', לא נגמלנו מקישינב.
Sorry. Just a minute. I have a problem. Okay, I'm going to end the show and start again. Okay, just a moment, please. I'm sorry, Lana. Something happened.
One screen up.
Yeah, no. Okay, I have to, just a moment. Yeah, sorry.
לא נגמלנו מקישינב ולא מנקמת דם ילד קטן. מילים מסיתות כמעצים חייתיים, מובילות אותנו ישירות לאפלה. אם יש אור, זה בקבוצת וואטסאפ, שבה מנחמים יחד חברה, שבהלוויה ספרה 11 קברים חדשים שהתמלאו, ועוד 9 קברים עדיין פעורים לגופות הנרצחים. ששיר זה יהיה לנר נשמה.
Toda rabba, Ilana. So in English, 7th of October, 2023. A, like a bomb in Hiroshima, endless grief landed on me, erased reality and filled my heart with ashes. A fallout of sadness covers my whole world, poisoning my thoughts, emitting radiation that turns my dreams into dark hallucinations. B, in the bed on the 3rd floor of the house, I hang between hallucinations and times. The noise of the planes passing in the black sky above me and the sounds of the attacks on Gaza return me to the hysterical messages on the radio about gas masks and to the horrifying noise of cars colliding at an intersection near the house of my youth. C, we have not freed ourselves from Kishinev and not from vengeance for the blood of a little boy. Inflammatory words like bestial acts lead us directly into the darkness. If there is light, together we comfort a friend who at the funeral counted 11 new graves that were filled and another 9 still open for the bodies of those murdered. Let this poem be a memorial candle. Thank you. Toda rabba. I am now going to pass the microphone, so to speak, to my friend and colleague, Neta.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Chanita. This was very touching, and I welcome everyone to the other section, the academic section of this launching event. I'm honored and excited to chair it, but I also have to admit that I'm a bit perplexed by the task of introducing Professors Cohen and Kronfeld in just a few sentences. If I were to list here their lifelong achievements, it will take me much more than 10 minutes, which is the time each of them is about to speak to us today. So I'll be short, and I will just say that our first speaker, Tova Cohen, is Professor Emerita in the Department of the Literature of the Jewish People at Bar-Ilan University, where she taught Hebrew literature for over 4 decades prior to her retirement in 2013. She chaired the department for 3 years and chaired the program for gender studies for 7 years. Professor Cohen's research focuses on 2 main fields: Hebrew literature during the period of the Haskalah and women's writing. She has published over 50 articles and 6 books in these fields. Her 2 recent books are A Silenced Harp, the life and work of the Italian Hebrew poetess Refael Morpurgo, and A Voice of Their Own, Hebrew women writers outside and inside their cultural tradition. Her talk today is titled Occasional Poem as an Expression of Female Connectiveness, the Case of Refael Morpurgo. בבקשה.
Thank you. Can I share screen? No, I have to have Al-Sha'ah for share screen. Okay, thank you very much. I just don't know how to enlarge it. Okay, you'll have to see it small. How do I enlarge it? Okay, thank you very much. We are not going to deal now with these very touching, wonderful poems we heard before about our life now. This is really sort of escapism, speaking about Refael Morpurgo, though there is always a connection between what you research and your life, which we might find. Fine. I'll start this very short words by the first presentation. And we would like, looking at it, should be sort of a short exposition, an introduction to the talk. We see her picture, which I'm not sure is realistic at all, but that's the only one we have. And we see her here, her book of 1890, Ugav Rachel. We are speaking about Refael Morpurgo, the first Hebrew woman poet who lived in Trieste, that then was the Italian-speaking community in the Habsburg monarchy, during really the 19th century, almost most of the 19th century. And my specific subject would be a very small and as if non-important part of her poems, which I call occasional poem. In Hebrew, the name is Shir Hizdamnut or Shir Le'et Metzo, which I like better actually. And I claim that through this genre of poems, we can learn something about Rachel Morpurgo in general, but more important, about the way she was treated by Hebrew criticism. Occasional poems are poems written for specific events, familial or communal, and they are usually considered by some critics, at least, as superficial, non-important, and lacking any personal expression. And indeed, that was the degrading tone adopted by the very important literary critic Dan Meron when referring to Rachel Morpurgo poetry. Right. And here we have what he said. This is in his article and then a book, Founding Mothers, Stepsisters, Imahot Miyasdot Achayot Chorgot, which is a very important, thorough book. And in the beginning of the book, he refers to Rachel Morpurgo. And this is just some words from what he said. She was one of the multitude of Hebrew Enlightenment rhymers, what a name, rhymers, versifying on the literature of enlightenment, a dilettante. Her poetic talents were negligible. And then he continues, between a wedding and a confession, she wrote, as one should expect, verses for weddings, births, and deaths, poems for the others, amusing readers, and of course, an epitaph for herself. Well, this is not very respectful for Rachel Morpurgo, as you can certainly see. And I actually have a whole book trying to explain why this is not the as I think should be read. Her poems should be read. I think it's inaccurate to start with. Result of what I regard a male biased misreading of her poems. Now, of course, I'm not going to speak about the whole subject. Instead, as a small example of my rereading Morpurgo's poems, I suggest to have a quick look at her occasional poems. Okay. As I see it, I think this moves without me, right? Somebody moves it? Because it moves without me. Okay. As I see it, there are two sources for the contempt towards occasional poems. One is a mistaken anachronism, and the other is a male bias of critics who determine good taste and therefore decide what should or shouldn't enter the literary canon. One sentence about anachronism. What some modern critics sometimes overlook is the centrality of occasional poems in the traditional Hebrew poetry of Spain and Italy, where they were a well-respected poetic genre and that were used by several renowned poets to express personal emotions. It is important to remember that Morpurgo wrote within this tradition. Therefore, the almost automatic dismissal of the genre is, as I see, anachronistic. But more important, and this is my main argument, the harsh judgment of these poems is a result of the natural male bias of Rachel male critics. Meron was not the only one, nor indeed the first, who ignored the influence of the writer's female identity on her poetry. Most likely, this possibility never even occurred to them. My view is different. I find Morpurgo female identity not only the explanation for her many occasional poems, but also the key for appreciating them. This key, I suggest, may be found in understanding the importance of connectiveness. And now comes the third presentation, which should have appeared only now. The connectiveness theory in feminist psychology is based on the studies of psychologists like Nancy Chodorow and Carol Gilligan. It emphasizes that female identity is formed as an integral part of the network of relationships that surrounds it. That network is thus critical to the development of the female ego and self-conception. A woman conceives of herself within a framework of relations, and her identity is largely constructed on a basis of these. This should move, but I can't move it. Oh, sorry. On the basis of this connectiveness. Consequently, and this should stay, to whoever moves it, this should stay. Consequently, understanding the place of relationship in the identity of female poet, even one like Rachel Morpurgo, who places as much importance on her intellectual identity as on her emotional identity, is integral to understanding her work. Rachel Morpurgo's natural need for connectiveness was not easily fulfilled. According to her biographer, Castiglioni, neither her husband nor her sons showed any sympathy for her yearning to study and write. She probably also felt estranged from both other less learned women and, as a woman, from most learned men. Against the background of this emotional desert, she did have some intellectual and emotional contacts with few friends and some members of her family of origin, the Luzzatos. And I said the Luzzatos, it's very interesting. She only wrote poems to the Luzzatos, never to the Morpurgos, which I think shows her love for them and not for the other family. But as a respectable married religious woman in a traditional Jewish community in the 19th century, she could not allow herself to express personal emotions in poems published in the public area, in the public sphere. We should remember that the very composition of Hebrew poems by a woman and having them appear publicly was already a pioneering and courageous leap over the cultural gender boundary. Exposing her emotions would have meant a further breach of the barriers of proper Jewish woman modesty, and that, it seems, she dare not do. And hence the importance of the occasional poems. Those poems enabled Morpurgo to create and express connections in two ways. First, the very act of presenting personal poems, either to relatives and friends, or even to the entire community. By doing this, she strengthened her net of relationships. Those poems I call poems of courtesy. They are decorative and elegant, a traditional present for a personal occasion, or even a communal event, but indeed they are superficial emotionally. Even so, they serve as a necessary vehicle for creating and preserving a net of human relationship so important for the lonely poet. However, many of the occasional poems are of a different, much higher quality, of a level which the established male literary critics did not fully appreciate, according to my understanding. Their importance lies in the expression of personal emotions in rich contextual language, and I name them, therefore, poems of emotional connection. Those poems certainly do not warrant the derogatory tone of the critics, and they merit a reading which recognizes their true worth. Let's take a very quick, and that's the last part of my talk. Let's take a very quick glance at two occasional poems, one of each type. Both were written, very interestingly, for the same occasion, the marriage of her beloved, much younger cousin, Rachel Luzzatto, to Shlomo Sulam from Padova, an event which was followed by the move of a cousin from Trieste to Padova. Could I have the next? Okay. Now, could I have the next one and then return to this? The fact that I don't. You see, the whole poem is very long. Now, could we go back to the first one, to the beginning? Thank you very much. I wanted you to see the whole poem. This is what's called a double sonnet. It's twice a sonnet. This is a very typical poem of courtesy, blessing the groom and the bride. In very short lines, and I intentionally put the Hebrew here, so we see how short the lines are, right? In the English, they become somehow longer. In very short lines, it is a very light and musical and very decorated, not only a double sonnet, but also look, the end of each paragraph end with the same word Shlomo, or Solomon in English, which is the name of the groom, which is really very elegant and nice as a present. But unlike many other poems by Morpurgo, it's also much easier, it's very easy to grasp because the language is very simple. There are really almost no biblical references. It's very unusual for Morpurgo. But on the other hand, it lacks the depth that is so typical to her other poems. This pleasant poem is indeed a vehicle for keeping family contact, but it has no emotional depth. No wonder, for example, that the speaker does not use the first person singular, which might express her own feelings towards the groom and the bride, but hides behind the first person plural, right? Nekave le'olam, we hope over, right? Levorei neyachel, of the creators, we request. Now, the plural can be either the family or the community. It's certainly not personal feelings. The second poem, and could I have the last page, please? Not this one, the next one. The next one, please. Right, thank you. The second poem, however, is much more personal. I just want to remind you for the same event. And the richness of emotions it expresses, especially when we compare with the first poem, surely makes it a poem of emotional connection. It is the first Hebrew poem written by a woman to a woman, expressing her love for her, and a true poetic expression of female emotion and identity. In the first person singular, the speaker, Rachel the poet, describes her love for her addressee, Rachel the bride, and then the tension between this love and the forthcoming separation. This she achieves not only by the direct description, but also by joining together biblical descriptions of love and separation. Of course, I can't go over the whole poem and explain it, but I would like to take just one small example, and that's the title, which you just can't see very well, Lezot Yikarech Efziba, in Hebrew, this one should be called I delight in her. And really, it's much easier and I think much more correct to refer to the Hebrew then, because it's so more elegant than the English. Chefziba is one word. It's actually, even in modern Israel, I think there are women called Chefziba, right? It became a name. And it really bears 3 layers of meaning describing love. The first one are the words themselves. Chefzi ba. She chose her, or I delight in her. This is already an expression of love. But there is a second layer, and that's the biblical connotation. And that's a verse from Isaiah, which I'll read in English, but it's also, of course, much more poetic in Hebrew. Nevermore you should be called forsaken, לא תקראי עוד עזובה, but you shall be called I delight on her, חפציבה, for the Lord takes delight in you. So this brings in not only the love, but also a feeling of religious and supernatural quality. I mean, the human love gets here another layer of spiritual and religious feelings. And then there is like a surprise, because Chefziba, whoever reads this and knows Bible, and the readers did know Bible in 19th century, thinks of the love of man to a woman, or God to Am Israel, but it's still in the man to a woman. And suddenly comes the first line, Rachel im Rachel niksheret. This is not a love of a man to woman, but a love of a woman to man, to woman, sorry. As I stated before, the first one in Hebrew poetry. Now I want to finish with a question. Should we then exclude Rachel Morpurgo from the important group of women poets who started Hebrew women poetry? I try to show how recognizing female identity and its expression in literature may lead to a re-evaluation of a poet and establish her place within the canon. And one word, I know this is so far from our life now, but perhaps this is the wonderful thing about literature. You can go into it, research it, and live another life together with your life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Cohen. This is, I thank you, and I agree. This is kind of like, the question was in place, and I think we all know the answer. Moving to our next speaker, I will start from the end and say that one of Professor Hannah Kronfeld's recent works is a proof text article, which is based on her current project on the land as woman, where she's in dialogue with Tova Cohen about the poetry of Rachel Morpurgo. Kronfeld is professor of the graduate school and professor emerita of comparative Hebrew and Yiddish literature at the University of California, Berkeley, specializing in modernist Hebrew and Yiddish poetry and translation studies. She is the recipient of the Akaviahu Lifetime Achievement Award for a research on Hebrew and Yiddish poetry. Her book, On the Margins of Modernism, The Center in Literary Dynamics, won the MLA's Calione Prize for the best book in comparative literary studies. She is also the author of The Full Severity of Compassion, the poetry of Yehuda Amichai, and the translator and co-translator from Yiddish and Hebrew into English of works by towering figures, including stories by Dvorah Baron, poetry by Yehuda Amichai, Dalia Rabikovich, Peretz Markish, Itzik Manger, and Benjamin Arshav. She is currently working on a book titled The Land as Woman, The Afterlife of a Biblical Metaphor. Professor Kornfeld's talk today is titled, I Can Write in the Dark, Radical Intertextuality in the Poetry of Adi קיסר. בבקשה, חנה. Hannah?
Yeah, I was having trouble unmuting myself. Thank you so much, Neta, and of course, Tammy and Chanita. This has been a long time coming, and it's nothing short of heroic that, especially given Neta and others, the horrific experiences that you had kind of very close to home, that you guys persisted and gave us this amazing new first issue of this new journal. I want to thank you, and I want to thank my brilliant research assistant, Oren Yirmiyah, who can't be here, but who really is responsible for turning my close reading of Adi קיסר into kind of a page of Mikraot Gdolot. So here goes. 10 years ago, in the wake of, not yet, please, the Zoom operator, oh, I thank you so much, Tammy, for putting all the work into getting the slides, but I'll get there and I'll indicate when. I have a couple of pages to go before that. So can we just, okay, thank you so much. So 10 years ago, in the wake of the 2011 social protest movement, the Ars Poetica, the new wave of Mizrahi writers in Israel, and in the process helped bring poetry as literary practice, performance, and polemics back into the center of Israeli cultural life. I take seriously the group's name as a cross-linguistic pun, spelled with an aleph. Ars Poetica is, of course, the prestigious Latin term denoting the vaunted meta-poetic genre of poems about poetry that goes back to Horace in the 9th century BCE. But spelled as the group does with an ayin, the group's name reclaims the Arabic term ars, pimp, which is a common Hebrew slang term, as you know, used to denigrate Mizrahi men. As Vital Levi pointed out, this sarcastic reappropriation of ars nevertheless retains the Latin metapoetic sense that marks Adi קיסר and the circle's serious concerns with poetics, and in particular with the intersections of lyric poetry and society. Contra the masculinist stereotype of the Mizrahi as an ars, קיסר has in fact insisted, not without a real struggle, on an explicitly feminist, inclusive credo and set of practices for the group and its highly popular events, which she also produces, events that are in the tradition of, performance, spoken word, etc., but really take it back to traditional Jewish practices as well. So the credo that she has insisted on, and many of the participants join, is an explicitly feminist, inclusive, for קיסר and the poets in the group and around it, especially Mati Shmuelov, Tehila Hakimi, and Ro'i Hassan, this is not just an outrageous joke, but part of a profound engagement with the Jewish textual echo chamber. Going back to the biblical metaphor of the whore of Zion, which features also in the background Tova of Morpurgo's engagement with Hefzibah. The Whore of Zion, who of course stands in the Bible for the land and the nation, especially in the prophets, and the history of the metaphor's abuses in colonial discourses about the land as a woman. For Kesar, it becomes a powerful site for constructing a poetics of intersectional solidarity between women, Mizrahim, Palestinians, foreign workers, and the poor. Much of Ars Poetica's reception has focused on the blunt statements many of the poems make about these issues, accusing them of sloganeering and being devoid of lyrical value. This is actually often the case for poetry by women and minoritarian groups. And that's the way, for example, Morpurgo was read historically. Reducing the meaning of the poems to the poet's biography or to the content of the political statements, as if the biographical and the political content were not always already mediated by the workings of verbal art, of poetic form, of ars poetica. So while the male poets in the group are often read in ways that reduce their poetry to the stereotypes about aggressive, impolite Mizrahi men, the poetry shouts, attacks, etc., the women's poetry is often reduced to the details of the poet's biography. In Kesar's case, some of the positive reviews reiterate the stereotypes about the Yemenites as a model minority. Research into the poetry of Adi Kesar, and I really applaud Lyre for focusing on that, on research on poetry, that insists on reading it, a research that insists on reading it as poetry, exploring, for example, the workings of rhyme, ambiguity, metaphor, allusion, irony, composition. And I've done similar work on the extraordinary poetry and short fiction of Mati Shmuel, reveals that very much as in the poetry of, surprise, surprise, Yehuda Amichai, the readability and clarity of the poetic statement gets the reader in, often gets her riled up, but what keeps her going back to the poetry again and again is the layered verbal art that belies all the frankly racialized preconceptions. So somewhat provocatively, and to counter the conception of Kesar's poetry as crass ethnic or political statement, I chose, with the help of my wonderful research assistant, Oren Yirmiyah, in the article for the first issue of Lyre, to use, for my annotated close reading of one poem, the format of a page of Mikraot Gdolot, the rabbinic Bible, where verses from the Bible are surrounded by translation, annotation, and commentary. So if we could go to the first slide, please, now. Thank you so much. I will read the poem in English first and then in Hebrew. And my translation is also in part an adaptation, but you'll see the commentary on both sides. And when you see the whole thing, it really looks like a page of Mikraot Gdolot. Maybe in real life, so it's called, I'm sorry, The Dominion of Night, Memshelet Laila. Maybe in real life, I walk faster when you, stranger, are behind me in a dark street, clutching the cell phone tight in one hand and my body in the other. But in my poems, I can for once not be afraid of you. In my poems, I'll walk ahead of you, slowly, slowly. I'll open my arms to the sides. Thank you. Yeah, maybe the next one, please. open my arms to the sides and spread out from the sidewalk all the way to the basketball court on the other side. I lie down on the asphalt, I'll breathe and check to see if the moon is waning or full. Next one, please. In my poems, and here comes the one that she was attacked for. In my poems, I'll crown an Ethiopian woman prime minister. Remember, it's called Memshelet Lyre, the government or the dominion of night. In my poems, Lou Reed will clear the dust from his fingers and sit down to write another million songs. In my poems, the security guard at the shopping mall will burn down all the stores and then will burn down all the bridges. They weren't built for people like me and like him to cross anyway. We are still the dogs. Read the next one. Yes, thank you. We are still the dogs, even if the caravan has disappeared long ago. In my poems, I undress the words, and you'll see them fat, large, with no makeup. Beautiful, beautiful. Maybe we can see the commentary also. Is that possible? Okay. In my poems, I'll build stanza houses because I've got no money for a flat. And through the walls, you'll be able to hear the shouting. Next one, please. Well, let's just take a look at that for a second. Okay, thank you. In my poems, Elohit, a godly she, will create the world 1,000 times over. In my poems, Bereshit, the in the beginning she, created divinely the heaven and the earth, and there was light. In my poems, I've learned already that I can write even in the dark. I remember where each letter is, even without looking. I've already learned that I can write in the dark. So I don't expect you to read all the commentary. You'll read it on the, if you want, in the journal. But let me just go over it a little bit. The poem is a pastiche of East-West citations and an ars poetic rewriting of Genesis 1:16, the creation of the moon and the stars. You can, oh, I forgot to read it in Hebrew. Do I have time for that? Neta? Yeah? Okay.
Yes, of course.
Okay, so let's go back to the poem. Sorry. It's really fantastic in Hebrew. אולי בחיים אני הולכת מהר יותר, כשאתה זר אחריי ברחוב חשוך, ומצמידה יד לפלאפון ואת היד השנייה לגוף. אבל בשירים שלי אני יכולה פעם אחת לא לפחוד ממך. Notice that she uses the slang form of instead of לפחד. בשירים שלי אני אלך לפניך, לאט לאט. אפתח ידיי לצדדים ואתפרס מהמדרכה עד מגרש הכדורסל. בצד השני אשכב על האספלט, אנשום ואבדוק אם הירח מלא או חסר. בשירים שלי אני אכתיר ראש ממשלה אתיופית. בשירים שלי לו ריד ינקה את האפר מאצבעותיו וישב לכתוב עוד מיליון שירים. בשירים שלי השומר של הקניון ישרוף את כל החנויות ואחר כך נשרוף את כל הגשרים. הם ממילא לא נבנו כדי שאנשים כמוני וכמוהו יעברו. אנחנו הכלבים, גם אם השיירה מזמן כבר נעלמה. בשירים שלי אפשיט את המילים ותראו אותן שמנות, גדולות, ללא איפור, יפות יפות. בשירים שלי אבנה בתים, כי אין לי כסף לדירה, ודרך הקירות אפשר יהיה לשמוע את הצעקות. בשירים שלי אלוהית תברא את העולם עוד 1000 פעמים. בשירים שלי בראשית בראה אלוהית את השמיים ואת הארץ ויהי אור. בשירים שלי כבר למדתי שאני יכולה לכתוב גם בחושך. אני זוכרת איפה כל אות נמצאת, גם בלי להסתכל. כבר למדתי שאני יכולה לכתוב בחושך. The poem is a pastiche. Thank you for the Zoom operator. We can go back to the regular screen. Thank you. A pastiche of East-West citations, you know, like Lou Reed and the Hebrew Bible. And an ars poetic rewriting of Genesis 1:16, the creation of the moon and the stars that have dominion over the night. But Kesar doesn't simply go with a traditional association in the West of the moon with feminine life experience, though it's that too. And here actually she does so with reference to the Jewish bookcase via a midrash about the moon, the feminine moon, the Levana, arguing with God about being given dominion only over the night. The waning and waxing of the moon are the result of the argument between them. The speaker calls on dark-skinned women to take back the night in all senses of that expression. I think she alludes to the English expression. But Kesar does more than that, deploying a sustained ambiguity of Memshala as evoking both the biblical account of the dominion of night, Memshelet Laila, in the creation story, and the modern sense of Memshala, government. In this way, she can both rewrite the androcentric biblical narrative of God's creation of the moon and the stars and settle accounts with the Israeli government that she implies is the reign of darkness. She develops throughout the poem a utopian alternative through the uses of queer ungrammaticality, Elohit Bereshit, radically inscribing, to rewrite both the biblical narrative and the modern political one, radically inscribing women's ongoing poetic creativity in the foundational myth of creation as the work of Elohit. And I'm repeating those lines in English. In my poems, Elohit, a godly she. In my poems, Bereshit, in the beginning, she created divinely, again, Elohit, heaven and earth, and there was light. And in the political domain, Memshelet Laila, as referring to the Israeli government, the utopian change she proposes links radically race and gender. Contra her Yemenite biographical ethnicity and calling into question the way she's read as simple identity labels, ethnic identity, the speaker will crown an Ethiopian woman as prime minister rather than the Yemenite, right, the model minority, expressing a deep solidarity with the most racialized dark-skinned Jewish minority, but also subversively alluding to the Queen of Sheba, which both Jewish and Islamic lore identify as the Queen of Ethiopia. But ultimately, self-consciously, the speaker acknowledges that these feminist revolutionary changes and the regime of an ongoing woman-centered creation can only exist in the domain of her poetry. For in the real world, the impoverished poet experiences what all women live with, walking fast, that page. Oh my God, I can't believe it. Here we go. Walking fast, sorry. As a stranger follows her at night. But writing in the dark is something she has learned to do. It may not overturn the dominion of night or the government of darkness, but it will allow her and all of us through the workings of her verbal art to explore revolutionary poetic potentialities Finally, I think Kisal's project compels a rethinking of Western conceptions of lyric as an essentially apolitical solipsistic soliloquy. You know, the scandal of the lyric, we're told, is that we are observing somebody talking to himself, right? It's a soliloquy. Indeed, as I've argued recently, these views, even in the West, are not more than a couple of hundred years old and can be traced back to a misguided interpretation of Romanticism. In the domain of Hebrew poetry and Jewish poetry writ large, both collectivity and intertextuality, in particular intertextual agency, where we have the right, indeed, the obligation to rewrite the sacred texts. That's what Midrash is, right? Intertextual agency have always been the norm. So I don't know if we're going to have time for Q&A, but I'm happy to discuss any of this or any part of the annotated translation and in the Q&A. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, both Professor Cohen and Kornfeld. You showed us that not only poetry, but talking about poetry can give some comfort and a time to be away from the daily horror and experiences that we've been going through. So thank you so much. And I don't know if we have time for questions because we actually need to move on, I think, to Tammy, right, Tammy, for the last section, the closing section of our event.
Okay, thank you, Neta. Towards the end of this evening, we would like to present some of the material from the creative section in Lyre's first volume, dedicated to the poetry of Dr. Sivan Arshefi. Sivan is an Israeli poetess, a lecturer of literature, and a mentor in poetry writing workshops in the creative writing track of the Department of Literature of the Jewish People at Bar-Ilan University. Sivan is also an editor of the Hebrew journal Atar, along with her husband, the poet Avishar Arshefi. Together, they also wrote the book We Will Soon Become. The poems of Sivan Arshefi are written with high emotional and linguistic awareness, such that it relates and responds to the tiny details that compose daily life. At the same time, her poetry never ceases to provide those details context and significance. Her poetry is mature, very precise, and rich with figurative expressions, stemming from a strong spiritual religious experience and from a depth of soul and spirit. Recently, her sixth and latest Hebrew poetry book was published, entitled Merachok, From Afar, and to give you a small taste of the special richness of her writing and to open a window to her source of inspiration, I will read the opening poem in this book, first in Hebrew and then in its English translation by Leah Katzeners. מעמד. ירדתי לקבל תורת ארצי ישראל בבית העלמין כנרת. מידי רחל, מידי נעמי, מידי רות אלישבע. ציפור צייצה, הושטתי ידי ונגעתי בהר. פתחתי בזוהר, הנח בשעת בוקר על מי עיניהן. היופי היה פשט, העצב היה רמז, הרוח היה דרש, השיר שעלה מן הלב היה סוד. Revelation. I went down to receive the Torah of the land of Israel in the Kinneret cemetery from the hands of Rachel, from the hands of Naomi, from the hands of Ruth Elisheva. A bird chirped. I extended my hand and touched the mountain. I began with the glow, resting in the morning hours on the waters of their eyes. The beauty was the literal meaning. The sadness was the hidden hint. The wind was the interpretation. The poem that arose from the heart was a secret. Sivan's marvelous illustrations adorn the poems, and I invite you all to visit the Lyre website and to see them up close. Now I invite Sivan to conclude this evening with a reading of her poem Ayalot, Heinz, which also appears in Lyre.
Good evening, everyone. My deep thanks to Tammy, Chanita, and Neta, and also to Ethelea for translating my poems. I'm very grateful for having my poems included in this very first volume of Lyre. And I'm sorry I can be with you here only virtually, but this is a very happy and dear moment for me. I would like to read you one of my poems, Heinz, and I will read it first in Hebrew, then in English. איילות, מה תצעק אליי? זהירות בכבודך בררנו איך לצעוק, כאיילות ולא ככלבים, פנימה ולא החוצה, ולא להרחיק כי לקרב. אחוזות צירי לחץ שהינו בכאב, מדדנו צעקה מול שתיקה, התלבטנו בו בכעס, אם מותר. ברוגז רחמים זכרנו, להרוג לך מן השוחות, להבקיע גם בעבורך את הווייתך לחודת גזרותיך. מכוונות ועפות אל מרחבי חסד נקבים קטל, בכתרך אל מסתתר. זורקות הדיסקוס, פיות פעורים מושלכים מעלה מעלה, בתנועה שרק כאב מייצר לצאת מן המיצר. אוהבות אמת צעקנו לך ולא עליך, גאינו כיולדות אותך. Heinz, why do you cry out to me? Exodus 14:15. With care for your honor, we checked how to shout, like hinds, not hounds, inwards, not outwards, so as not to distance, rather bring closer. In the pangs of contractions, we remained in pain. We measured each cry against silence. We debated if anger is allowed. In anger, we recalled compassion, to cry out for you from the foxholes, to break through even for you, your existence, entrapped by your edicts, aiming and flying towards expanses of mercy, pulling like dew in your crown, God in hiding. The discus throwers, open mouths, are tossed upwards, higher and higher, with momentum only pain can create, to flee this distress. We, lovers of truth, shouted for you and not to you. Like women in childbirth, we bellowed you. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank all the participants and speakers who honored us with their words. Our thanks to Professor Tova Cohen and Professor Hannah Kronfeld for their interesting and enriching lectures. With the speedy return of the hostages, the recovery of the wounded, and the success of our IDF soldiers in the war, may we be granted many days of poetry. Thank you all.
תודה רבה.
תודה רבה.
תמי, ברכות. תודה. היה ערב נהדר.
Thank you.
תודה רבה, תמי.
תודה רבה, להתראות.
תודה לכולם.
היה מרתק. תודה רבה.
תודה
בהצלחה.
ובהצלחה.
תודה לכולכם וכולכם.
Thank you very much.